Um, One of the stories in your book that moved me the most personally was the story of your encounter with the Amish people in upper state New York. Can you briefly describe that for me now?
I had such a fascination with the Amish. And in the community, I lived in a very small community in St. Lawrence County, and there was an Amish community of probably 75 families that lived very nearby, 5 or 6 miles away from where I lived was where their settlement was. And I was working as a feature photographer, kind of a photojournalist. I wrote stories and mostly did photography for the local weekly newspaper. And every time I drove through Amish country, I just drove through like at 20 miles an hour. I'm fascinated with this. It's like every single farm was like a calendar image. The clotheslines were just row after row after row of these blue clothes flapping in the wind. I mean, as a visualist, I'm in heaven. Mm-hmm. There's not even any electrical wires, no electricity there, no rusted cars. They don't have cars. You know, it's just like the elements were gorgeous. It was timeless. There's horses churning and chorning through the meadows, and I could see in the winter the breath coming out of the horses' nostrils. It was just, the images were so compelling to me. And I kept thinking, I have to find a way to photograph, because that's the first thing you ever learn about the Amish, is you can't photograph them. We have no right. They have granted us no permission. So I've always had to honor this, but I'm always looking for the loophole. So one night, I'm fantasizing constantly. I know just what I'm going to shoot when I finally get permission to shoot, because I can't believe I'm not going to be able to scheme my way into this community. So one night on the news, we hear that an Amish buggy had been hit by a drunk driver. 2 of the kids were in the hospital with broken bones. And I think immediately, oh, ha-ha, the Amish don't have insurance. They don't have money for hospital bills. So I could go out there and do the story on the Yoder family whose kids were hurt, take some photographs, get them published in the newspaper, and get everything I want under the guise. Now, this wasn't backhanded, because really what was drawing me equally was, you know, creating a call to the community to like rustle up some money to give to the families. I mean, it's all one community. We're all living in the same community. So we could generate some cash for them to pay their medical bills.
Is it something like the right thing for the wrong reason?
Yeah, I would say so. So anyways, it seemed like the perfect idea. So I go to the first Amish farm on the road and I say, I want to do this idea. Who do I have to go to get permission? And they say the bishop, and he lives just down the road on the left. So I go to the bishop's house, and a lady comes to the door. She lets me in. I stand there. My first time standing in an Amish household, you know, and I'm just like looking around, noticing how stark it is and how clean, and nothing on the walls, and all these straight back chairs, and nothing on the floors, and smells of cooking. And the bishop comes out, and he's not like happy to see me. No. And all the while I'm explaining to him, we heard about the Yoder family. I said, I work for the newspaper. I'd love to do a story on the family, and we can generate all the money to pay the hospital bills. He's not even looking at me while I'm talking. He's looking out at the field, and he's like playing with his gold watch on his chest. And after I was done, he said to me, we're out, we want to have our privacy protected. The Yoder family doesn't need you. Our community doesn't need you. And we can come up with whatever it takes to provide for our own. We came here to practice our religion and to be left alone. And I was just so like, oh, rats! How am I going to get my way? And all of a sudden it became all about me getting my way. You know, I had like lost my integrity in the matter. But I said to him, but Bishop, I said, I can't tell you how hard it is for me as a photographer to drive through this community day after day and to be so moved by how you're living your lives. And I said, it really enhances my own spirituality. I learned my lessons from your simplicity. I learned to reevaluate my life based on how you all have made your choices and live out your commitments in life. And I'm very honest in saying these things. I'm pleading with them. Please let me just have my images. Let me take these pictures home and put them on my wall. And he stops me in mid-path and he says, it may be hard for you, but that's not my concern. And it sounds like you need more help than the Yoders. Whoa. Now would you please leave, he says. Boy, and I just, thanked him for his time and left. And when I got to my car, I was ashamed of myself. I knew I had stepped in territory I had no business in. I knew that my appeal was just like all about me, all about my selfish needs to have these great photographs on my wall. And when I finally accepted that I couldn't have access to that world photographically, but it was my neighborhood. I could drive down those roads all the time. I still went to I bought all my lumber from the Amish. I bought my breads and pies from, I could still have my relationships with these people. Mm-hmm. And that was the greater thing. Mm-hmm. To have my experience of these people in my community. That's what I should be after. Not an 8x10 glossy of a fraction of a second that's put on my wall so someone says, oh great, Jan Phillips has the on. She, what a coup. So once I accepted that and got off that, then my experience with them became much richer. And I became much more of a, better neighbor for having had that experience.
Which is, in a way, I suppose, an art also. And I think it's fascinating that you would include that story in a book on how to create art. Because that story is about how not making a work of art. Something about authenticity and responsibility as an artist there. Do you want to say anything about that?
I think there's a great deal of responsibility. I remember being in China once and this American guy comes up to me. He saw that I was a photographer. And he comes up to me and he pulls this thing out of his photography bag. I said, what is that? He goes, it's a right-angle lens. It was like a periscope. So he puts it on his camera and it's photographing people over there. Now my first thought is he should be ashamed of himself. Shame on that. Because as a photographer, I have always felt that before I take any photograph, I first establish my relationship with a person so that there's a level of intimacy from which will come their beauty and their spark. That's why my photographs are beautiful. That's why my portraiture is compelling, because it's not just a stolen snapshot of somebody. It's a record of a relationship I have with this person. I have very few photographs that I don't have a story to tell about, that I can't remember what all surrounded that piece. I would never think to take a right-angle shot of somebody that they're unknowing of.
It's exploitative.
I think there's certain requirements of us as artists, certain reverences we must take with us and hold tight to as we're doing our creating in the world.
Good point. I want to go off on a slightly different direction now and ask you why you think it is so hard for women in particular to be creative. You mentioned that in your book, and with the pun on the word knots, there's a sense of the knots that bind us, the K-N-O-T, that tie us up, but they're also the N-O-T-S that prevent us from doing our creative work. Why is it so much harder for women than it is for men?
Well, it's the N-O-T-S's that really have done the damage to us. I got it from my mom, too, as well as from the nuns in the Catholic school. But you're not supposed to think of yourself first. That's a selfish thing. I think women are really trained to be nurturers and providers for. We're trained to, create safe spaces for everyone else. We're trained to be humble and submissive. I went to church with my mom 2 weeks ago. That's the sermon. Women be humble and submissive. I was like, this is still going on. This is not some mentality from the 60s. This is in the late 90s. Women are still being told to be submissive in churches, places where we should be able to trust the message. And so women, I think, traditionally have always, look at women were never even allowed to go to art school. And they wonder why there's no women artists from the Renaissance. Women were not allowed in medical school. Women were not taught to perceive ourselves as creative people. No one ever nourished and nurtured us as artists. I think it's a miracle that there's any books by women in these libraries. I think it's a miracle that any of us have burst through that barrier that says, A, you should spend your time being of service to people, and B, you're not good enough, smart enough, rich enough, bright enough, pretty enough, all those things we don't think we are, to succeed in an ambitious pursuit. Creativity is very ambitious. It takes much more confidence to be a creator in the world than it does to be a clerk typist, which is a technical skill that anybody could. A chimpanzee could be a clerk typist, I think. But for that clerk typist to go home and craft a poem takes confidence, and nobody has fed us that confidence. That's why this book is me being a cheerleader. It's me saying, go girl. Of course, not only can you do it, but I need you to do it. I need your stories, because I learn from people's stories.
And if you couch it in terms of relationship, then women will be likely to be empowered, because...
Right, because if someone says to you, I really need to hear your story, you'll tell me. But chances are, unless I say that to you, you will think, I should ask her questions about her life, because my life isn't important.
Right, I would think I'm being audacious. She probably doesn't want to hear about me.
Right.
So the safest thing to do is to ask her questions.
But who have you learned from? Who have I learned from? I've learned from the poets that have dared to write their poems, from the novelists that have wrote those novels that have turned me around 90 degrees in my life, from the brilliant music that has so touched me. I fall to my knees at some arias that are out there. If those artists had not had the confidence and the courage to pursue that, in the midst of their doubt and their fears and that darkness that comes sometimes, then I would be deprived. Libraries wouldn't exist.
Who are the most inspiring artists you know? Who has influenced you the most?
Sometimes it's not even so much what they've done, but that they've done it. Like I think of Judy Chicago, that she created that piece in community with several women. The dinner party,
yes.
That she created that piece inspires me. I was inspired by Judy Chicago long before I saw the exhibition. And poets, Adrienne Rich has inspired me. Not just her poems, which have moved me forward, but her nonfiction works. Adrienne Rich is all through this book. I wouldn't want to live without what she's contributed to me. I'd be so much less of a person. Judy Grant's poetry has been important. Women in my neighborhood who have written poems that have so touched me. Karen Elias, she doesn't have a book of her poems out. She's one of the most brilliant poets I know. Amy Bartell, painters who are paintings about the essence of our lives, paintings about our political struggles, paintings about homophobia or racism in our society, people who are creating works that say something about the rainforest, that say something about the environmental issues we're all concerned with in our lives, people that are really creating works of art that have us reflect on the world that we live in, that take into account our level of responsibility in the world, even when there's no apparent market for those works. I mean, there is now, because a few of us started Syracuse Culture Workers, which publishes that kind of, I call socially responsible art. They have a women artist date book now for women artists to be featured. And they do a peace calendar that focuses on many different global issues. Mm-hmm. So there are publishers and distributors now of that kind of art. So there's an opening, there's a place that's receiving that, and therefore adding to the generation of that kind of artwork. Mm-hmm. But prior to that, you know, it's like I create a piece for myself or for my sisters or for my family or whatever. It doesn't mean it's going to ever see the light of day. It's going to ever get published. You know, it doesn't mean I'm ever going to make a nickel on what it is I'm creating. But I still have to choose to create because I can't not, you know.
The reader can get a good idea of who has inspired you by the wonderful sidebars in this book.
Oh, yes.
And one of my favorites is the one by Georgia O'Keeffe, going something like, I've been terrified every moment of my life, but it's never kept me from doing a single thing I've ever wanted to do. I love that one.
Yes.
And I also love, and I can't remember the name of the person who said it now, what are you going to do with your one wild and free life?
Mm-hmm.
So now I'd like to ask you, what are you going to do now with your wild and free life? What are your creative aspirations for the future?
There's a good question. I think one of my primary commitment is to meet with as many people as I can meet with. I'd like to do workshops with 10,000 people over the course of the next year. I'd like to be able to be in the company of people that are on the edge of their creativity and summon that spirit forward. So they get to have the experience of feeling that, of hearing their muse. I think the workshops, because of the exercises that we do, really have a person experience what this book is talking about in a community setting. And so they don't forget. So when they go back home where they're isolated or alone or something, they remember the impact and the greatness of that feeling. So that for me feels like it's a creative. That's my creative process. Mm-hmm. That I work with people on manifesting their own abilities. So I'd say that's my primary work in the world. But I'm also 99% through with my first screenplay, which I am going to believe into production.
Yes.
I don't know that the Academy Award thing is a reality, but I'm certainly going to visualize that creatively.
Yes.
And I have 2 other books I'm working on. One is Untying the Knots That Bind Us, and another is a book of, it's called Highlights and Shadows, a woman photographer's search for the light, which will be about how my own seeing, how the process of my being a photographer over the past 25 years has changed my life, you know, how that's transformed me as a person based on what I've seen and how my process of seeing has contributed to other people's transformation, the power of our images.
Mm-hmm. Well, I'll look forward to seeing all of that. When you talk, I get so fired up. I want to go home and turn on the music and start writing short stories. And what would you say to the listener of this conversation who may not have the opportunity to be in one of your workshops, but who also gets fired up listening to you talk? Is there one nugget, one jewel of advice that you could give us to go away with in terms of how to realize ourselves creatively? What do we need to hold on to remember most of all?
Here's that. What we need to remember most of all is, I think it helps us to surround ourselves with the art that's really affected us in our lives, to have very close to us the poems, the music. Find music that turns you on. Find music that energizes you. Keep those books close at hand and remember, because I know you know those poets did not have an easy time of it. There's times when they were going to give up. Imagine your life, look around your house and imagine your life without any of that art. I count on those artists. I count on them getting it out. And people are counting on me to get it out. I am counting on you to get that short story out. So remember, I say to people who have a hard time with their creativity, remember that the rest of us are out here going, we need it from you. We need what you have to say, how you're going to write it, what you're painting. We need your music. Any of those things that you're creating, we need that. And also I say, make a circle of other creators. Be in community with other creators. It helps to hold us accountable. It helps to have our first audience so that we feel there's a place where our stuff goes, or what comes out of us, or what we create from nothing but our own experience. It gets to be received. There's some feedback. There's some loving, supportive, affirmative feedback from each other that helps us reshape it so that the final piece may be good enough to get published if that's our goal. It might be good enough it might be universal enough to see the light of day. We can help each other craft those pieces so they're great enough to be published, or as a collective, as a community of artists, publish our own works together. It's very inexpensive these days to publish our works together and figure out how to do community showings of our art, So I would say circle with other creators.
And once again, it's all about relationship with one another, with our communities, and with our muse.
Absolutely.
Thank you so much, Jan. This has been a real pleasure.